Hello everyone, and welcome to the tithe as a foreshadowing of the Messiah, and today we will establish that the tithe is a contract. So in Numbers 8:15 we find that the Levites will go in to do the work of the tent of meeting. At this time we are dealing with the tabernacle, and in the future, from the standpoint of this time, this work will be transferred to Temple 1 and Temple 2. In verse 16, for they are entirely given to me. That means the Levites have one job. They are not to choose their own occupation. They cannot be farmers if they want to. Their job is to work at the tent of meeting or otherwise at the temple. What is that work? It says, I have given the Levites as a gift to Aaron and his sons. This is referring to the high priest. At any given point in time, Israel had a high priest. All the Levites were given to the high priest in support roles for his work in making sacrifices unto their forgiveness of sin. It says here, to do the work for the Israelites. The work of the Levites and the high priest was for the nation of Israel. In the tent of meeting, or otherwise the temple in the future, and to make atonement for the Israelites. The entire job of the tribe of Levi was to make atonement for the sins of Israel. Numbers 18:20 and 21. The Lord spoke to Aaron, you will have no inheritance in their land, nor will you have any portion of property among them. Now this is in reference again to the Abrahamic covenant. God told Abraham, your children will inherit land. And God is saying, well, remember that promise that I said you would inherit land? Well, no, we're not doing that. We're going to give you the tithe. It says in verse 21, see, I have given the Levites all the tithes in Israel for an inheritance. Part of the inheritance was also the priesthood. Right? God says, I am giving you the priesthood as opposed to giving you land for your inheritance, for the service that they perform, the service of the tent of meeting. So God has given the tithe to the Israelites as an inheritance and as recompense for the work they do at the tent of meeting or in the future at the temple. Joshua 13 and 18, the chapters. This is confirming what Moses has said from Numbers 18:20 through 21. Dear Levites, you are not getting land. Right? You are promised land through the covenant with Abraham, but you're not getting that. Instead of that, you're getting the priesthood and you are getting the tithe as your inheritance. Looking at this from an infographic standpoint, the Abrahamic promise provides the basis for the tithe. The Abrahamic promise says everyone's getting land, but the 12 tribes of Israel get land, not the Levites. So instead of the land, the Levites get the tithe. And so the Levites are supported by the entire nation, that is the land of Israel, through 10% of the agricultural produce of the nation of Israel. So we have the 12 landowning tribes of Israel who work as farmers. They take 10% of everything they produce in the field, that is the harvest and the flocks and the herds. They take that 10% and they give it to the Levites in the form of the tithe, which is food. So what happens if that doesn't happen? Well, we have the historical record in Nehemiah 13. Nehemiah also discovered that the portions for the Levites, that is the tithe, that is the food, right, the 10% of the agricultural produce, had not been provided. Well, what happens then? And that as a result, the Levites and the singers who performed this work, that is all the work at the temple, had gone off to their fields. Well, they were getting hungry. Okay, if the food is not coming in, they get hungry, so they have to go work in their fields. Now, when it talks about their fields, it's not, they were scattered throughout the entire nation of Israel. So all the different tribes got their own piece of land, but the Levites did not. But that doesn't mean they were floating around in the clouds. They did live on planet Earth. And so when it talks about their fields, they did get fields, but they were not supposed to be farmers. They were supposed to be working at the temple. But when they don't get the tithe, that means they don't eat. And because they get hungry after a while, they do end up running off into the fields and taking care of their business. In verse 11, it says, so I registered a complaint with the leaders asking, why is the temple of God neglected? Well, if the Levites do not receive the tithe because the 12 landowning tribes of Israel are not giving the 10% of the agricultural produce of Israel, well, then they get hungry. The Levites go into the field. They start working, generating their own food. And so the temple is then neglected. Numbers 18, and it says, their meat will be yours. This is in reference to the 10% of the agricultural produce that is coming from the 12 landowning tribes of Israel to the Levites who did not own land. They also received the offering, and in verse 19, all the raised offerings of the holy things that the Israelites offered to the Lord, I have given to you. So the 10% of the harvest, 10% of the flocks and the herds go to the Levites in the form of food, so that they can nourish their bodies and not starve to death. This is a perpetual ordinance. It is a covenant of salt forever. This contract, this setup, where the Levites are performing spiritual services for the nation of Israel, but then the 12 landowning tribes, they are caring for the physical needs of the Levites. This is a perpetual ordinance, and it is not changing. What that means is that if somebody changes this tithe law as it is described, they are law breakers. Numbers 18, continuing to discuss the tithe. And you may eat it, that is the tithe, in any place. It, the tithe, is your wages for your service in the tent of meeting. This is the tithe. The tithe does not pay for anything but the forgiveness of sin according to the law. That means if somebody starts wanting to pay a tithe or receive the tithe in the name of something different than the forgiveness of sin, well, that person is a law breaker. In verse 32, it says, and you must not profane the holy things of the Israelites. There are two ways to do this. Okay. One way is, for example, okay, if I were to set up a tithe practice different from this, let's say that somebody was paying tithes to the local church or somebody was paying tithes to the synagogue. That would be profaning the holy things of God, because that is in direct contrast to what God has said. Or if someone said that the tithe pays for church activities or synagogue activities, that would be defiling the holy things of Israel, because that has nothing to do with what is said here. The Bible plainly tells us the tithe pays for the service at the tent of meeting. And the synagogue is not the tent of meeting, and the church is not the tent of meeting. Also, if someone receives the tithe who is not a priest making sacrifices unto the forgiveness of sin, well, that person is profaning the holy things of God, because it is in direct disagreement with what God has said. So that is the first way to profane the holy things of Israel. That is, to use it in a way for which it is not set aside. Now, a good parallel would be sex. Okay, now sex, according to the Bible, is confined to the marriage. Now, if someone says, well, I think sex is a good thing, and so therefore we want to expand the use of sex, so let's do sex over here and do sex over there, well, guess what? It breaks. You are defiling the holy thing that God has made. In the same way, people who try to take the tithe and say, well, it's good here, well, let's use it over here, let's use it over there, they are defiling the holy things of God and holy things of Israel. There is a second way to define the holy things. And so God knows, God is smart, right? And the priest, I think, if we were to ask them, if we were able to ask them, dear priest, do you really think that you are taking care of the sins of Israel? I think if he were honest, he'd say no. He would say, you know what? I am imperfect. I am an imperfect priest. And the sacrifices I make, well, those are also imperfect. And so an imperfect sacrifice from an imperfect priest is never really going to cover the sins of Israel against a perfect God. Okay. God knows this. The priests know this. I know this. The rabbis know this. This is straightforward logic. This is straightforward reason. However, because God knows this, and I'm going to show this in future videos, God has said, I will myself fulfill the tithe law. I have created, this is God speaking, I have created the tithe law as a mechanism to free Israel from its sin, and also the sin of the world, okay? Well, free the world from its sin. And I know that you can't do it yourself, so I'm going to do that. God is going to provide in the future from this standpoint, from this historical standpoint, from the timing of Numbers 18. From that historical standpoint, God is saying, I will provide a perfect priest. And that perfect priest is going to be given the perfect tithe. And that perfect priest is going to make a perfect sacrifice. And that perfect sacrifice is going to be the real sacrifice that is going to cleanse Israel and the world of its sin. And so when God says, you must not profane the holy things of the Israelites, I believe God is speaking to this future priest, to this future sacrifice, to this future perfect tithe that's coming, at least from the standpoint of Numbers 18. And the Jews are not allowed to profane the holy things of Israel. That means that they have to believe what God is going to do. They have to put their faith that God is the one who's going to deliver that perfect priest, deliver that perfect sacrifice, deliver that perfect tithe to make that perfect atonement of sin. Or else, if the Jew does not get along with that Jew is going to die. So this is very serious business. So any Jew looking into the tithe law must understand that that Jew has a decision to make. Okay, if that Jew says, I'm not interested in the law, I don't care what the law says, well, there you go, you're going to die. If, however, the Jew says, ooh, I see that God is making a prophecy here towards a final priest, a final tithe, a final sacrifice, a final forgiveness of sin. I want to be involved in that. Well, in that case, that Jew is going to live. The tithe contract is simply this. The tithes, right, pay the Levites to perform a spiritual work for the entire nation of Israel, that is the 12 tribes. They're doing spiritual work for themselves, but they're also doing spiritual work for the 12 tribes of Israel. The 12 landowning tribes of Israel, they are farming for themselves to provide food for themselves and their families and their children and their wives and their husbands, but 10% of that is going to the tribe of Levi to support their physical needs. So we have an exchange. We've got the physical needs being met in one direction and the spiritual needs being met in the other direction. So with that, we will conclude our video. We hope you learned something. We hope you have a better understanding of what the tithe is all about. And I bid you welcome to our next videos in terms of researching the tithe as a foreshadowing of the Messiah.